The title used to be way bigger. It used to be like no-till, organic, intensive, regenerative agriculture that allows you to earn a living and save the world. And that's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but not necessarily. I feel like as farmers, we take a lot of responsibility on ourselves to do lots of different things. Right? Earning a living is never enough. So, I'm going to start by asking the question of, are we in the midst of a small farming revolution? I started farming commercially 11 years ago, 2008. At that time, practices were fairly standard if you were like a small-scale vegetable grower. Maybe not like backyard garden, but a little bit bigger than that. There was no social media, right? So if you wanted to see what other farmers were doing, you either had to go visit them or wait till the end of the year and go to a farm conference. But there's very little exchange of ideas, unless you're seeing in a magazine. There was not a lot of innovation. If you traveled around to the farms in the valley, everybody was kind of doing everything the same way. Most people were tillage-based, tractor-based, at least to some degree. At that time, you might recognize that guy, Elliot Coleman. Right? He was kind of the pioneer of the era. Right? He was pushing people to grow food. 4-Season Farming was his book, right? And he had these ideas that one person on a farm could handle 2.5 acres. So if you had a 5-acre farm, that was 2 people, right? On average, a vegetable farm could gross revenue, $10,000 to $20,000 per acre. And that was like the goal. Like you wanted to strive to be like Elliot Coleman. At that time, if you were a farmer, and maybe this is still valid in much of the farming world, but the number of acres that you farmed was like this badge of honor, right? The bigger, the better. If you were 10 acres, that was better than 5 acres. 5 acres was better than 2, right? But based on what Elliot Coleman said, the size of your farm was a simple equation. If you assume that expenses of growing food are 50%, if you wanted to make a living of like $30,000, you just had to plug it into the equation. $30,000 income means you had to have $60,000 worth of sales. That means you needed to have a farm of 3 to 6 acres, right? If you wanted to make 60 grand, you needed to have a farm of 6 to 12 acres. That's a pretty big vegetable farm, 6 to 12 acres to make, you know, whatever, a reasonable income. If you've ever heard of the National Young Farmers Coalition, it's a nonprofit group that advocates for young farmers. They were looking at how if we have a world with the average age of a farmer is 58, most people don't grow up on farms anymore, how are we going to get non-farming people to become farmers if you can't offer them the idea of learning a living, right? It's going to be very hard to make up for farmers that are retiring. And to come up with 6 to 12 acres is not an easy task. They did a survey every year, and year after year, there were 2 conclusions. Young farmers don't have access to land, and they don't have access to capital, right? No bank wants to lend a young farmer a lot of money. And then it seems like something happened, right? Local food and organic food became more popular. Farmers markets and other outlets began to expand. A lot of non-farmers, for a variety of reasons, started to look at getting into farming, quality of life reasons. And so you get this influx of college-educated, people coming out of professional careers to go into farming. They have no farm experience. They have no access to land. But on the bright side, they have no bad farming habits to inherit, right? They have no peer pressure from the family, right? they're starting from scratch, and that's a good thing, right? Because of this, they use a lot of experimentation, a lot of innovation, and they're very business oriented. The other thing that happens is social media explodes, right? You get on Instagram and you can see farms all across the country, what everybody's doing, discussions of why they're doing it, techniques is all at your fingertips, right? You don't have to wait for the annual farm conference. So quick and easy access to the sharing of information. The end result we get, like in the last 5 years, a rush of innovation as it comes to growing food on small scales. In about 2013, I first heard about this guy. I don't know if you recognize him or heard of him, JM Fortier. He's from Quebec. Small market garden farmer. Made the claim that he had grossed $145,000 on an acre and a half. Just to clarify, when Elliot Coleman said an acre, he meant an acre. When JM says an acre, he is looking at how many beds he is growing on, and he is calculating the bed top, and he's adding up bed tops to get to an acre. So an acre of bed tops might actually be 2.5 acre farm, an acre of growing. So just, there is a little bit of a difference. But even so, that's a big number. When people were striving to make 10 to 20,000 an acre doing Elliot Coleman's strategy, to hear that number left you in like disbelief, right? And what JM was promoting was really intensive production on the space that you have, no tractor. Like that is so un-American to even think of, right? 2 to 3 people per acre, minimum, compared to Elliot Coleman, who said one person can do 2.5 acres per person, right? And in order to grow it intensively, you need more people. And the first thing people say is he must live by a big city, right, to make that much money. That's not the case. He does not live by a big city. So I was skeptical, but over time, you know, I read his book that he put out in 2014. I highly recommend it. What he says makes sense. Right? This is a picture of his original farm. Right? Acre and a half of bed tops, nice little farm. If you're trying to make a living as a farmer, this is way more achievable looking than 12 acres of vegetables. So JM kind of starts this innovation, this revolution, and people are running with it now. Connor Crickmore is in New York State, Never Sink Farm. He just announced this year $350,000 on 1.5 acres, and that's his farm. Right? These are numbers that people have a hard time understanding or believing.
Do you believe it?
I do. 350 stuff. I don't know all the details. So, what did they all of a sudden discover, right? Is there some holy grail to making that much money, right? And how does it affect you as a home gardener or a small farmer? I'm going to talk a little bit about concepts, but in the end, I'll try to give you some practical advice so you can kind of apply it at whatever scale you work. So the name of this this revolution is known as organic no-till. It's kind of the term that it goes by. And there really are no miracles to it. It's just rethinking that process. What we know is that tillage is time and resource intensive. It's expensive, has many drawbacks, and this model focuses on soil health as your highest priority. The second key is you're going to grow intensively, as much food off of a square foot as you can, which means lots of successions, right? Really kind of picking up the pace of what you're doing, rather than just getting bigger and growing extensively. There's a lot of disadvantages to getting bigger. And the third focus, for them to try to make that amount of money, they are focusing on very short life growing crops. Salad, high-value salad mixes that turn over every 4 weeks, and they just keep flipping beds. Probably not something you're going to do in your garden, but that's how they're achieving those numbers. I'll talk a little bit about the first two as we go on. So, tillage, long-standing debate. Tillage is integrated into American agriculture. We can argue that it's necessary, but we know that it's bad for the soil. Right? Deep tillage breaks compaction, which is very important for growing plants, but driving tractors on soil creates compaction. Right? It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Cover crops build organic matter, but tillage injects air into the soil, it excites the soil biology, and it burns up that organic matter. Right? I just saw a stat the other day that 56% of organic matter is carbon. So if you wonder how we're getting so much carbon in the atmosphere from farming, it's because of tillage. Cultivation, we know, kills weeds, but the act of cultivating disturbs the soil, bringing up new weed seeds, creating new weeds. So you end up on that treadmill. We rototill to get a good seed bed, but that rototilling kills the soil, kills the microorganisms, it pulverizes the soil tilth, which creates new issues of crusting, compaction, water retention. So we know that plants grow better with less issues in a high organic matter soil with good tilth. Yet we always kind of set ourselves back when we till. And there's a lot of debate. I feel like as a farmer who has done tillage, there's always been this sort of tension between the idea of the gradient of permaculture on one end, right? Very little soil disturbance, right? But not always shown to be as productive as a tillage environment. So you have a high tillage, hard on the soil, but high yields, permaculture, don't often see it in a production scale. Where's the best place to be on that gradient, right? How do you balance the issue of soil health and food production? Especially, not a big deal in your garden, but if you're trying to make a living farming, that's a big consideration, right? So you ask the question, how can we farm with the same care that one would typically garden, right? Yet still achieve production volume. What is that sweet spot? I feel like organic no-till doesn't necessarily present a totally new way of doing things, but it's the one that's trying to seek the balance on that gradient the best. And here we go down the rabbit hole. Because what is tillage? Or for all these guys that are claiming, hey, our farm's no-till, they immediately get roughed up on social media because people think what they're doing really is tillage. Like, what is tillage? We know a plow is tillage, right? But what about a hoe? When you're scraping and disturbing that soil, is that tillage? It's still disturbing the soil. And if you say, yes, any disturbance to soil is tillage, well, what about when you stick your 2 fingers in the ground to put a transplant in? You're disturbing soil. Are your fingers tillage? The problem with this is that people are getting hung up in like the dogma of no-till. They're getting stuck on figuring out the terminology, and I think we need to look past that. Basically, your goal is to minimize tillage as much as possible in your unique situation. And your situation is going to be unique because how much compaction you have is going to vary by site. Type of soil you have is going to be different. How much organic matter you have in your soil is going to have an effect, right? And that's all going to affect whether you can practice no-till or need tillage, at least initially, right? And this is going to be a long-term approach to move to no-till. Your goal is to not only protect the soil structure, but there's now a new focus also on the life in that soil? How do you protect soil biology? And I think this is a big reason why double digging used to be sort of the standard. I think that was kind of John Jevons' bio-intensive farming, the idea of, who's familiar with double digging? Has anybody done that? So it's an idea of like you take a scoop of soil out and you set it aside, and then you go down and you loosen the soil below, and then you move that topsoil back on. So you've managed tillage below, but you haven't inverted your soil, whereas like a plow flips your soil in a person. Well, now that's idea's kind of out because that's a lot of disturbance still. You're breaking up, you're still breaking up and disturbing your soil when you're double digging. The nice thing about tillage, what every tillage farmer loves, and why we have so many implements that do tillage, this is the bed shaper. You look at that soil, like there is nothing easier than pushing a seeder down a bed that looks like that, right? Or transplanting into that, piece of cake. Terrible for your soil, but very easy on the farmer, right? When we talk about a seed bed, what we're talking about is the top layer of the bed you're planting into. That interface between you and the plant and the soil, the cleaner that seed bed is, the easier it is to deal with, right? If you're trying to push seed through a chunky bed, chunky soil, lots of debris, it poses some problems. So that's the crux of this argument. How do we protect soil structure, encourage soil biology, and have a reasonably good seed bed while doing something that's considered no-till? And there's lots of variations on this theme. I'm really going to just hit on the one. I don't even know if it's the right one, but it seems to be kind of the leading candidate. And this is, the goal of this is to use beds, permanent beds, but they're still farmers are allowing themselves to disturb that top inch or two of the bed to get a good seed bed without disturbing all of the life that's below it, and never moving that bed where you have to knock the field flat, build it back up. So whether you call that a semi-permanent bed or permanent, right? The idea is if you're only disturbing that top little area where you're planting, any loss of biology that occurs will quickly recolonize from the bed below it, right? And it's a minimal amount of disturbance, so you're going to minimize your loss of organic matter. And the one thing I would want to point out is we're talking about organic no-till. If you get on the internet and start looking up no-till, it might take you in a totally different direction. So make sure you put organic in there. No-till is a concept that is widely practiced by large agriculture, people who want to reduce soil erosion, but they do it very differently. They basically are substituting tillage with chemicals. So instead of plowing a field, they herbicide a field and direct seed into that. That is called no-till as well. It's just not the organic variety. So just to clarify. The tillage we're talking about, or the farms we're talking about, you look at that, like, make anybody envious, right? That's a beautiful farm. This was a farm that was tillage-based, raised bed, tillage-based for 3 years before realizing kind of the downsides of tillage. They switched to a no-till system, organic no-till, for the past 7 years. Beautiful farm, human scaled. They make 10 times the yield that an average farm in California makes, right? An average vegetable farm does about 2,000 an acre conventional. They talk about even tillage-based market gardens that can do about 10,000 an acre, and they do 110,000 an acre on vegetables. Singing Frog Farms, they're kind of held out as one of the pioneers of this method. This is another picture of Never Sing Farm. This is your $350,000 an acre guy. But you're talking again, an acre or two permanent raised beds. intensively cropped.
Great.
This guy is pretty anal. He string lines all his beds.
Okay.
He has 2 stakes in the ground at the beginning of every bed,
Uh-huh.
and he runs a string line on them. So anytime he's doing something, he's making sure he's keeping his paths open.
I like it. Okay.
So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept, but I can't cover it all in a short talk. There are great resources out there that describe all of this. It's the idea of like the French intensive method has been around for 100 years. But like 2 of the older books on this, Bruce Stout, Gardening Without Work, her subtitle's the best of all of them, for the aging, the busy, and the indolent. And then we have this guy from like 2005 somewhere. These 3 are brand new. JM's book, Curtis Stone, you may have heard of. Curtis Stone's book is maybe more of a backyard scale. JM is bigger than an acre. And then the top right one I haven't even read yet, it's brand new, but that is from the editor of Growing for Market magazine. If you've ever read that magazine. So if you're interested, the Market Gardener I know tells you how to do this very specifically. We also have the internet. TheMarketGardener.com is JM's website. No-Till Growers has lots of podcasts and articles. I can put this up at the end as well. NeverSingFarm.com, Singing Frog Farm, they talk about their methods. You can glean so much information just by kind of listening to these farmers talk about what they do. A lot of them now offer online courses. If you're really into it, NeverSink has courses, JM has courses. YouTube videos. I mean, how did anything ever get done or fixed before YouTube videos? Unbelievable. What do all these farms have in common? Back to your question. They all use permanent beds. All right. And here's a big asterisk. Before you run out there and go turn everything into permanent beds, you need to set yourself up for success. If you have a perennial weed problem and you make permanent beds, that weed problem is not going away. So try to get that under control. Right? Issues with grass. Here we have quackgrass, right? Rhizome-based grass. It will take over your permanent beds if you have not addressed it. A couple of ways to address it. If you want to use the soil, right? Tarping, right? Covering that and smothering it. If you've ever left a piece of wood on your lawn, you pick it up 3 days later and it's like half dead. Same idea. You put a tarp over the area you're going to farm. The problem is you have to do some pre-planting on this. It takes time to smother and kill grass. So you can't do it 3 days before you want to plant your garden. You're talking many months. A lot of way people get around this is they don't deal with the soil that they want to grow on. They basically build up from the soil. So that lasagna, it's also called the sheet mulch method, where you're basically bringing in all your materials above the soil, and that way you don't have issues with weeds or compaction. This is easier to do, obviously, on a small scale. I don't know of many large-scale producers who do the sheet mulch method. If you're going to use the soil to make beds, most farmers, even though they're considered no-till, they use tillage in that initial step. And I'm not saying I recommend that, because you are harming your soil, but on a large scale, this is a BCS with a rotary plow. It's like, looks like a prop on a boat. It's basically pushing soil to the right side. So you go up one way, down the other. It pushes the soil into a bed. So they use tillage to establish the beds. Once the beds are established, then they never use tillage again. You could probably do it. You could do it without tillage. I mean, you could do it with a shovel, but it would be backbreaking. So what's the approach with those raised beds? Your idea is you want to manage your weeds proactively. You want to keep your soil covered as much as possible, whether that's with a growing plant. Ideally, it's with a growing plant, because having roots in the soil has amazing benefits biologically, right? But if you can't keep plants in the soil, you still want to cover them with a mulch, cover crop. Silage tarps are like the new rage all of a sudden, and you'll hear that a lot. You'll be like, what does the silage tarp have to do with food production? You see in the picture below, anytime you have bare ground, when you pull that tarp over it, the sun hits that tarp, it warms up the ground underneath, all of your weed seeds germinate and immediately smother. So it's a way to stale bed your soil. If you can kill all your weeds right then if you can plant into that ground without disturbing new soil, you've already taken care of a lot of your weed pressure. Right? Rather than tillage, planting, 3 weeks later for the rest of the summer, weeding all the time. One other way to smother those weeds is you have a permanent bed top. They're doing compost applications right on the top of the bed. They're not working it in. They're just layering it on there. Some people do 1/4 of an inch. Some people talk about deep mulch where they do 2 to 3 inches. I haven't experimented with it enough, but they're basically planting right into that compost layer, right? And then the roots will grow through that and then down into the soil bed.
So what's the difference between a silage tarp? Is it like a regular tarp, or is it?
Silage tarp is plastic, but it's UV treated, so when it's out there, it doesn't break down. And it's not woven. If you went to like a hardware store and bought a woven tarp, those things get beat up, they fray, there's plastic everywhere. These things stay together.
Black or white?
They're usually two-sided, black and white. You usually want to do the black up to attract the heat. You want to warm the soil. I mean, that's the point of them. They're proving that people are just starting to use this idea, and they're finding there's lots of benefits. They smother the weeds, but they also, if it's spring and you want the soil to dry out and it's raining and raining and raining, they pull their tarps over to exclude that rain, so that when they pull it back, they can get in the ground, even though everything around them is too wet to plant. Warms the soil up ahead of time, so again, useful in the spring. So the new steps, in the old days, if you had a garden, you bring out your rototiller, right? Make it nice and clean and neat, and then you would plant. Now, you have these permanent beds that are out there. They will be compacted. I know on our farm, when we tried this, we ran into issues right off the bat because we had 2.5 feet of snow sitting on the beds all winter long. We had high clay soil. Our organic matter isn't as high as we wanted it to be. There was no getting around it. When the snow melted off and you went to plant into that bed, it was very firm, too firm to get good growth out of it. We planted plants in that versus freshly tilled beds. The plants did better in the freshly tilled beds, but we didn't give up on it. We knew that we had to address these issues. How do we increase our organic matter in those beds? How do we improve the biology in those beds? How do we find ways to break that compaction without using tillage? And there's a lot of new work out there. There was a soil workshop in Whitefish this winter by Nicole Masters that talked a lot about the idea of using biologicals, compost extractions to sort of get the biology to break up the compaction for you, rather than tillage. You're swapping biology for mechanization. Where we're at, if you know about calcium and magnesium, calcium in soil keeps the soil open so that water can move through it, keeps it from compacting. Magnesium has the opposite effect. So if you have soils high in magnesium, you tend to get compaction. Very hard to change that relationship. Right? It's very hard to change your ratio of calcium to magnesium, so the best thing you can do is add organic matter. So a lot of this comes back to that simple idea, right? You're trying to improve the organic matter in your soil, and you're not doing tillage in order to help with that. So now you have these beds, maybe they're compacted. Instead of putting the rototiller on them, most of these farmers are using a broad fork. If you've seen that big long fork with tines to stick it in and lift to break the compaction, but not really disturbing. Is that tillage? Maybe, but who cares? It's what they have to do to break compaction. Some farmers are finding now after years of farming this way that they no longer, the soils will improve to the point they no longer have to broad fork. They're not getting compaction in their beds. Their organic matter is going up. So this is a process. Like I mentioned, you're doing the least tillage you can do in your situation.
If you have a tall cover crop, then instead of rototilling it in, how would you get it back into the soil?
Another tool that's super common in this system is a flail mower, which is, if you're familiar with a flail mower, the blades run over the top instead of this way.
Oh, okay.
So like a normal lawnmower chops everything up and it shoots it to the side. A flail mower comes over the top. It drops everything right where it was. And you can actually scalp soil or be right above the soil. So you're basically obliterate that cover crop right onto the ground in place. And that BCS, they make flail mowers now for these BCS walk behind tractors, and that's what a lot of people do. Some people don't do cover crops, they do compost instead. I do like the idea of cover crops because I think having roots in the soil is important. Compost is great, but it skips that step of having the roots right there on site. So you go through with your broad fork, you've broken compaction in your bed, you add compost, you add any amendments. If you're using an organic fertilizer, sprinkle that right on the bed top, right? But you still might have a crust on that bed top or chunks on that bed top. Some people, by having a silage tarp on it, when they pull the tarp back, it's ready to go, but that may not be you, right? If you have a crust, you know, people are using just a rake to shallow disturb that to make that seed bed. There's a tool called the tilther, which has been in the podcast world a lot, which is, what's that?
Just repeating the words for it.
The tilther is a little tiny, I mean, it's a rototiller, but it's tiny. It's powered by a battery operated like a DeWalt drill. Johnny sells them. So you're like, you push this little tiny tiller and it tills about an inch deep, you know, so it just disturbs that top. The other thing people are using, again, scale dependent, is a power harrow, which is what you see on the BCS. A power harrow, unlike a rototiller that does this and pulverizes things, a power harrow has like 4 times that spin this way. It just kind of stirs the top inch of the soil to loosen it without inverting it. They do it at a very low speed, so it's not, you know, pulverizing. It's just mixing. And there's a roller on the back, which makes sure it doesn't go too deep and leaves you a nice seed bed. So that's kind of the process that these guys, gals, are using. Broad fork, add your amendments, create your seed bed with the least amount of tillage possible. A couple of cautionary points. If this is interesting to you, just be aware that you can't skip steps. I talked about our experience with clay soils. If you have low organic matter, compaction will be an issue. Don't ignore it, because you will see the effects of compaction in the plant growth. And there's just a little graph, you know. If your roots can get down, you will see it in your top growth. If your roots can't get down, your plants will be stunted. They won't look as good, right? So you have to, you might not like tillage, but you have to figure out a way to address compaction. You just can't skip over that step. So your goal is no tillage, but it may take time to get there, right? And that's the tricky thing to figure out, right? You're going to use the least amount you can.
How deep does the bed need to be?
I mean, you don't necessarily need it to be a bed at all, a raised bed per se. Most raised beds, though, tend to be 4 or 6 inches, unless you're like a commercial strawberry grower and they're big. But raised beds have other benefits. Primarily, they warm up faster in the spring. They drain water. When you get too much rain, gravity pulls the water out of the beds faster. So on a production scale, we use raised beds for those reasons. It allows us to get in the ground. You know, when all the flat area is too wet, the raised beds are usually dry enough to work. And they're easier on your back. If you're picking out of a raised bed, that 6 inches makes a big difference when you're like down on your knees harvesting across the bed.
So if you have a 12-inch frame or something around, that's enough soil matter to grow most things? Or because I'm understanding a lot of things need to grow a lot deeper than that. So.
They will try to go deeper. We grow on native soil, right? And most farms don't bring in soil or build like hard-sided raised beds, like in a backyard garden. I mean, I'm not super familiar with having done, Patty, maybe you know, like sheet mulching, lasagna garden type stuff where you're working above your soil. I assume your roots are still going to make it down into the subsoil.
Okay.
I mean, if you put a 6-inch soil bed on a parking lot, I'm sure you would see issues, right? The roots would come down, they'd hit the asphalt and not go anywhere. That wouldn't be enough.
But even if it's a rocky subsoil, it'll still have some benefit.
I would think so, yes.
Okay.
Especially if you don't overwater the surface soil, you're wanting to water deep, so those roots will chase that deep water and let them help you. But if you just keep surface watering, you're gonna run into problems.
So you're gonna train your plants. Instead of watering a little bit every single day so they get lazy and their roots just stay up on the surface. Like, this is great, the farmer comes out every day and waters me, right? You water deep and then you hold back water, and that plant realizes if I want to drink, I gotta go down and find the water. So you're training that plant to grow roots to the water table.
Can you explain what you mean by watering deep? Like, does that mean just heavy watering and then wait?
Getting the water down deeper in the soil profile,
Okay.
right?
Patty, is there a process that you do? Like, am I supposed to be like?
Just leaving your water on longer
Okay.
at
Gotcha.
each time. Less frequent waterings for longer periods of time.
Okay.
And
Trickle watering?
what's that?
The trickle watering that you do, is that what that works also?
Any type of watering, whether it's drip tape or overhead. The idea is to get the whole soil profile wet,
Okay.
but as the top dries out, you know, the roots will go down to it'll stay wetter deeper because there's no sun exposure on it, there's no transpiration. So there's gonna be water deeper most of the time, even when the topsoil is dry. And so your plants will go down and find that. A lot of minerals that they need are down deeper in that soil profile. So you should end up with healthier plants if you get their roots to go deeper. One other issue that there's a lot of hype about mulches, hay, straw. You look at Singing Frog Farm's picture, all those light colored squares were straw bales that they were putting out. It's great, but there can be issues. One that we ran into was slugs. And when I looked it up, the internet is full of people complaining about slugs. So I don't know, in terms of how to deal with that, I would say composting. If you have a slug issue, using composted materials would maybe cut down on that more than just a raw straw or hay. Patty, I don't know if you have ideas. I mean, setting slug traps.
There's a whole topic on itself.
Yeah.
Workshop on it.
So just realize it's not foolproof. I mean, we did a whole high tunnel of head lettuce this winter in a compost that had a lot of wood chips in it. And we grew the lettuce in September and October when it could grow, and then we held it over so that we could harvest it in November. So it sat in the high tunnel for a long time. Typically it would sit there for a month and you would harvest it and sell it. Here it sat for 3 months. Probably 50% of it was unmarketable because the slugs moved in. I think because they liked the wood chips and then they damaged the crop. So something to be aware of. One would argue if you had lots of other pests or predators or more life on the farm, that they will find a balance. It's kind of the goal. You're gonna bring something in that likes to eat slugs, and that's your answer.
How do you cook a slug?
I think raw is best.
We'll talk about it,
A little sriracha and Tabasco. So that's that first point of tillage. The second thing I had pointed out was the idea of intensive versus extensive. And just that idea, intensive is growing more food in a set area. Extensive is always branching out to grow on more area. Brooke is smiling at me. Small space allows you to maximize your time, cost, and effort. And just think about that. If you need to put compost on your field, you have to buy it in maybe. So how much are you going to need to buy? How are you going to get on your bed tops? You're going to use a wheelbarrow. If you're doing 1/4 of an acre, that probably seems really manageable. If you grew your garden to 5 acres, that's a whole different task all of a sudden, right? Imagine if you could grow the same amount of food that was on 5 acres in 1 acre by changing how you do your successions and how intensively you grow. You now have to take care of a much smaller space without giving up the production. And I think that's the goal, right? You can make your soil, it's a lot easier to improve your soil on a smaller area. So what are some of the things you can do to grow intensively, right? Well, it's back to that idea of you want to maximize your soil health, right? You want it to be a deep, loose, mineralized, high organic matter soil. So you put a lot of care into that soil because you can afford to do so because you're not dealing with a lot of it, right? You're going to use beds rather than single rows. And beds just mean, it can mean a raised bed, but you can also have flat beds. It just means you have, say, a standard pattern across the field. A 30-inch bed, a 12-foot path for walking, a 30-inch bed. Within each bed, you have many rows of crops. If it's carrots, maybe it's 3 or 5 rows. If it's fresh cut green, it may be 12 rows within that bed. But the days of the cultivating tractor in a single row of green beans down the bed, right, that is not a very intensive method. Single row is kind of out. Tighter plant spacing, right? Packing more plants into that bed space, but beware of what I call the goldfish effect. You know, a goldfish, the bigger the bowl, the bigger the fish. Or the opposite, the smaller the bowl, the smaller the goldfish. It can backfire you. If you plant your cabbages too closely together, instead of getting a big cabbage, you get a little cabbage. They grow in the space that they're allowed. If you like little cabbages, that could work in your favor.
My father, who 100 years ago farmed, right on the Yellowstone River in Montana, and they did in the spring. They took horse manure and compost, put it into the soil every spring, and one year they paid for a 4-bedroom house and put themselves through veterinary school for the proceeds of 1 year, and they did it for 80 years. And that was their specialty, but that was not no-till, I guess, because they turned the compost and horse manure in every spring.
Yeah.
So what is that called versus no-till?
I mean, I grew up on a farm in Connecticut where same thing. We grew a cover crop every winter.
Okay.
It got to be that big. It got plowed in with a moldboard, disc harrowed, manure got added. It grew vegetables still does to this day, 45 years. It's not to say you can't grow food that way, but if you look at being in a world where we have carbon constraints all of a sudden and we're thinking about things differently, that system may grow food. It does grow food, but if you're trying to get at carbon issues, organic matter in your soil, can you grow food on that soil for 200, 300, 400 years? It's what's fueling this shift, partly this shift to no-till, right? We want to start to 2/3 of carbon that was in the soil is now in the air.
Wow.
So the goal is to get it back in the ground.
One thing I remember so clearly was the tomato that he grew. It was so delicious.
Right.
So I've never tasted one since. And everything tastes like plastic compared to what he grew there.
Sure. Well, farming is mining,
Yeah.
right?
No question.
You're taking minerals out of the ground, you're putting them into the fruit, you're eating that fruit. If you don't put the minerals back in the soil year after year after year, you just keep extracting minerals, the quality of that food drops over time. Right?
And our genetics have changed dramatically since.
Did that horse manure and the compost put it back in?
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah. I mean, without doing a soil test, who knows? But yeah, you're keeping up with adding inputs to keep up with your
I
extractions.
mean, I put a spade in the ground and I got 12 worms to go fishing right away.
Yeah.
They were so healthy.
The thing that was common back then too, my father would say, rototillers weren't really common. Right? A plow and a harrow, you're not pulverizing, you're still doing tillage. The advent of the rototiller, because it makes that perfect seedbed, kind of took tillage to a whole new level of soil degradation, I would say. Yeah, I guess soil organic matter levels differ by climate, how much rain you get, freeze thaw, but on average in this country, pre-European settlement, 6 to 10% organic matter was common. In most agricultural areas now, we're just above 1%. And 56% of that is carbon. All of that carbon is in the air. If you're losing organic matter at that rate, how many more years of farming do you have on those soils? Right? It's what's fueling this shift to we can't ignore soil carbon anymore. We can't ignore organic matter. It's why things that your grandfather did, which were commonplace, are now shifting to this approach. So, tighter plant spacing, but beware you can go too tight. A great thing to do is envision what a healthy plant looks like, and that's your distance between plants. Right? If a broccoli plant is that big, you don't want to make it grow in an area that big. Right? Give it the space it needs, but don't give it 3 feet. Right? Maximize that space. Quick plant successions. Something that a lot of gardeners don't deal with, but it is a great technique. Many gardeners I talk to, it's like they get excited in the spring, they plant everything at once, right? And then in July, when they have 38 heads of lettuce already on the same day, they're kind of like, whoa, what just happened, right? Doing multiple plantings. Imagine as soon as you harvested something out of your garden, you put something in the ground before the end of that day. So something's growing again. There's now roots back in the ground. You're not just leaving bare soil for weeds to grow on, right? By flipping your beds, and they're doing this 3, 4, 5, 6, depending how long the growing season is, 6 times in a year, just turning it over. They're they harvest half a bed, there's still the crop in the other half of the bed, and a new crop is coming in behind it. Right? Because their soil, they've taken care of it, they've amended it, the soil can hold up to that. And it actually benefits from having the roots in the ground. Because so much of your soil biology is fed by plant roots. Right? There's a relationship there. Another idea, we don't do it too much, but if you really want to push the envelope, intercropping, where you have 2 different crops with 2 different characteristics growing in the same space. And maybe you have head lettuce and you have radishes, and the radishes grow to maturity before the head lettuce gets too big to shade them out. Right? So you're taking advantage of that space around each plant. So you might have 2 or 3 different crops in the same bed top. You're using time differences as a benefit. The other one, which we use a lot of in this climate, is season extension, right? Growing more food means that you can grow food for more of the year, right? Here in Kalispell or the Flathead, some years we have 110 days between frosts. One year we had 69 days between frosts, right? If you're not covering crops, you're probably losing them or reducing their yield. So the idea of using row cover is a very inexpensive tool to use that I've talked about in past presentations. Row cover with simple hoop systems, caterpillar tunnels, hoop houses. If you're a gardener, you're probably not going to get a high tunnel, but if you're a small grower, high tunnels. Another thing that people don't usually think about is season extension, but growing your plants in a greenhouse, even if it's off, whatever, in your kitchen, off your house. If you're planting a transplant into the ground versus planting a seed into the ground, you've just shaved off like 4 to 6 weeks of required grow time. So if you're direct seeding things and they're not maturing for you before the frost, start them inside when it's still nasty out. Then as soon as they're ready to be planted, they have a head start. So why did I choose this as a topic today? Right? Because it's pretty exciting, I think. It's an evolution of the bio-intensive methods. But we have all this new emphasis on it. We have new tools, new techniques, but most of all, this is a scale, this is probably the most appropriate scale if we are looking to have more farmers in this country, right? If most of our farmers are 58 years and older, and we need a new batch of farmers, and they're not being born into farm families, which means they have no land to start with, and they have no capital to start with, how are we ever going to have more farmers? This is their entry point, right? I think anybody could find an acre somewhere or multiple backyards and suddenly have a viable career as a farmer, which I would say was unheard of just 10 years ago, right? Hopefully it encourages people, instead of looking at farming as like, that would be cool, but no way, maybe people give it a more serious look. And, as I mentioned before, and I'll put them back up, there are a ton of resources. You are not alone if this interests you. There's great books, tons of social media, online content to help you become a better grower. Question?
Yeah, my background's in medicine. We're having real problems with glyphosate. Anybody know how to get rid of that in food? We're trying to.
Stop using it.
We can't, but I'm saying it's everywhere. It's in the water. Every beer, every wine has it now.
Yes.
Is there any way in farming to get rid of in your crops, like to say that everything from the water to the soil?
I mean, I don't know what the half-life of glyphosate is. The real one, not the advertised one. It can probably leach out. I'm sure fungi have something to do with the answer. They have an amazing ability to detoxify
Nobody has
things.
an answer yet, though.
People have to stop buying the food that it's put into. Like, that's the only thing we can do.
I just talked to someone who had worked at Kamut, if you're familiar with Kamut.
Yeah, they've got it now. Right, right.
It was such a great story about how it's an ancient grain, it was grown organically. It's great for people who have, what's the word, gluten intolerance, because it's an older variety that doesn't have the same effects. They just lost their European market because they have glyphosate residue on their organic crop, because it's not from drift, not from neighboring farmers, but they believe because of the rainfall. They're getting glyphosate out of the rain. Time just did an article about that, how it's 90% of pregnant mothers' milk, breast milk, it's measurable in rainwater. So there are definitely chemicals that are.
Children, you know, from the autism rate from 1 in 12,500 to now 1 in 36.
Yeah.
And they have more than
Yep.
here.
So there's a lot of reasons to move to organic food. This had to do with soil health.
Right.
But the thing that's going to drive us here, I think, is what you're saying. People are going to look at the human health statistics. They're going to look at people they know and what's happening to them. That's what's going to finally drive.
What's really fascinating is our bodies are made up literally 3/4 of what the soil is.
Sure.
We are that soil.
Yeah.
That's
They've got
cool.
biome.
Thank you.
So I think we should be proactive and get on the major food manufacturers' websites. They all have a common place on there. Go in there and voice your comments that you do not want glyphosate in the source product. Because it's coming in from the wheat, soybeans, and the corn, and then going through all of our foods.
Thank you.
So they're the ones that get the power to do something, and we are the ones that really have the power because we got the money in our pocket, whether we spend it or not. We just flat tell them we're done buying it, we do not want it, period. Tell them exactly what you don't want. Don't leave anything for question, and just slam them.
They're aware.
They're business owners.
Yes.
They're gonna follow the profit margin.
What's their
As soon as
advantage?
it's not profitable, it will switch.
What's their advantage to not getting away from it?
Well, it's the profit margin. But if you look, I just talked to someone who was at a trade show with all the big chemical companies. They see the writing on the wall. They are now marketing biologicals. They get it that they have to deal with soil a different way, and that there's going to either be glyphosate's either going to fail them in reality on the ground, or the consumer backlash is going to be so severe that they see it. But that doesn't mean it's a cash cow. They're not going to move away as fast as we want them to. Question over here somewhere?
How do you spell that?
What?
Glyphosate.
Glyphosate?
Yeah.
Glyphosate. It's basically the main ingredient in Roundup. It's the primary ingredient. Glyphosate. And that's just an important thing to consider. Everybody wants to ban glyphosate. I don't think that's the answer. Because glyphosate, when they do away with that, they're just going to plug in something else. And most of the herbicides out there are far worse than glyphosate. You want dicamba, you want paraquat, you want all these other horrible things? No. The answer is not to get rid of glyphosate, it's to get rid of those herbicides, chemicals in general.
Get rid of the practice.
Reach it, sister.
Thank you. I have a question,
Yep.
Todd.
Yep.
Do you plant your lettuce seeds indoors?
Yes,
and
we transplant
them?
all our lettuce
So
now.
you transplant them as a single plug?
Single plug. We now use Salanova, which is a Johnny's variety. Grows a head of lettuce, but it's been bred that when you cut the base of it, it falls apart into a salad mix.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Wow, cool.
So instead of, we no longer fresh cut, we used to have to plant a whole bed of lettuce and you cut it as a single leaf, right? You had to sit there with scissors and forever. Now Salanova, you cut the head. it falls in.
Does it regrow from that?
It can, but it's faster to
Plug a new one in?
plug one right next to it. You don't have to pull it out though. That sort of thing. You cut one and you plug into one next to it. And it grows back. Yeah. I shouldn't give away trade secrets. Salanova is a good one.
When you're planting inside, what are you planting into your seeds? What do you, what's the mix?
We use a organic Pico down by Big Arm, south end of the lake, potting soil. It's local peat moss. He adds organic fertilizers to it, like a blood meal, a bone meal, and something else. And we just use 100% that. You could blend that in with compost or soil, but we've always just used that mix in a variety of different trays. For like salad, we do it into what's called plugs, so that you plant the seed and you pull that plug and it goes right out in the field. Other things we transplant multiple times in the greenhouse to get a bigger plant. It just depends on what variety you're talking about.
So you're making your own one?
So this
That's
is,
a plug tray.
The tray we're buying, but the plug, when it pops out, the soil, the roots have grown through that soil and it holds it now into a plug that you stick in the ground.
this is the place you're talking about that is adjacent to the lake that says, "We're not always here."
That's the
Yes,
one.
okay.
Ted Tompkins. He's a one-man show. Pretty impressive.
Open the chance for
Okay.
appointment.
Yep. Great product.
Got a question on carrots. Everybody really, especially in eastern Montana, was so dry, be successful and even get them to germinate right? Do you got any, how wide should they be and how thin should they be, and any trade secrets on how to control it?
No. We singulate the seed. We use a planter that singulates so that we never have to thin carrots. Because thinning carrots is a horrifically tedious job. So
That'd save a lot of money too, because you're.
yeah. So a jang seeder is a type of seeder that has a space for one seed, so at a certain spacing, instead of something that's just dropping seeds, or if you were doing that.
Is that pelletized then, the seed?
We don't use pelletized. It can be. We find the seeder actually works better without a pelletized seed. But if you're hand planting carrots, it's a very small seed. We do 3 rows on a 30-inch bed, so they're 9 inches apart. We could make that tighter if we wanted, but the tool, the hose that we use to weed fit between that better. So we'd have to change our whole system if we wanted to go tighter. Watering, there's no roots in a seed, so we talked about deep watering. Think about the opposite. When you have a seed, it has no roots. You don't need to deep water seeds. They need the opposite. They need frequent watering a little bit at a time, right? You don't want the seed to germinate and then dry out because it dies. You want to have water on it every day to keep it damp. Once it gets established a little bit, then you shift to deeper water. There's no benefit of deep watering a seed, right? It can't get at it. Some people put down like burlap, wet burlap on the top in order to keep it wet. We don't do that. I think that's it.
Is it in a mulch, somewhat mulch bed or no?
It's in a raised, no, I mean, for us, it's just in our soil, our standard raised bed.
Let it canopy.
When I say raised bed, it doesn't mean like a wood-sided cedar bed. It just means we had an implement behind the tractor that pulls that soil up. For us, we're so wet out there that when it rains a lot, the water ends up in the furrows, the path, and the bed top stays dry. That's the main reason we do it.
So, if you are so intensive that you're actually replanting right after you've harvested
Yep.
something, so how do you deal with that you need a different watering frequency for the mature, the half-grown crop versus the newly seeded crop? How do you work with that problem?
It would just be whatever. You probably probably put more water on for the plant that needed a lot of water. You'd overwater your seedling, but that's your compromise. If you're doing drip tape, probably not as big a deal. Overhead, you'd be probably putting a lot of water out there.
What do you do about your aisles as far as do you mulch? Or do you recommend people to mulch?
You can mulch
Is this one
them.
problem?
You can mulch them. We shallow till them. A lot of this stuff we're still in process of implementing. So if you came out to the farm, you'd think I was a hypocrite because I don't have all these things in place, right? It's a work in progress. We still do some tillage. We try to do the least amount of tillage. And you get in an argument about wood chips and plant debris, and there's a lot of debate out there on what to do with the paths. Some people in this system are, if you're familiar with landscaping fabric, it's that woven fabric that you use in your yard. A lot of people, they don't want to use plastic mulch on a bed, single-use plastic mulch. So they go out and they buy a sheet of that landscape fabric, and they cut holes into it, and they plant into those holes. It suppresses the weeds, but the benefit is at the end of the season, they roll it back up, and the next year they roll it back out. So they get a bunch of years of use, kind of a compromise for how to suppress weeds.
With the full-grown crop at the end of the year, are you saying you don't pull the whole root, everything out, you just chop it off?
A lot of farms will they'll cut the plant, leave the roots in the ground because there's a benefit, and they'll take the plant tops out and they'll compost them and bring them back. At our scale, we flail mow them. We come in and we just obliterate, like broccoli stalks that stick around for like 10 years. We just obliterate them with a flail mower, and they end up instantly applied.